In 1975, there was not just one car that everyone wanted, there were several. And together they defined what it meant to drive in America at the time. Because back then, cars were not just machines, they were identity, they were freedom, they were something people dreamed about long before they could even afford one. And if you walked through any American street, any parking lot, any gas station, you would see them everywhere. Bold shapes, long hoods, loud engines, cars that felt alive, and yet. Today, many of them are gone, almost like they slowly disappeared without people even realizing it. So what really happened to the cars that once dominated the roads and captured the imagination of an entire generation? And why do they feel so different compared to what we have today? To understand that, you have to go back to a time when America itself was changing, when the energy crisis was beginning to reshape priorities, but people were still holding on to something bigger, something emotional, something that cars represented in a way that feels almost impossible to recreate now. Think about cars like the Pontiac Firebird Trans Am, a car that instantly stood out with its aggressive stance, wide body, and that unmistakable hood design that made it look fast even when it was standing still. This was the kind of car that didn't just get you from one place to another. It made a statement. It told people who you were. And even though by 1975 its engine power had already been reduced compared to earlier muscle car years, people still wanted it because it wasn't just about numbers, it was about presence, about how it made you feel sitting behind the wheel, looking over that long hood, hearing the engine come to life, and knowing that you were driving something that mattered. But the Firebird was not alone. Cars like the Chevrolet Camaro were everywhere, another symbol of American performance. Another car that had already built its reputation in the late 1960s and carried eye. But the Firebird was not alone. Cars like the Chevrolet Camaro were everywhere, another symbol of American performance. Another car that had already built its reputation in the late 1960s and carried it into the 70s. The Camaro had a different personality, slightly more refined in some versions, but still aggressive, still powerful in appearance, still something that people aspired to own. And, just like the Firebird, it was affected by the same forces that were changing the industry: lower horsepower, stricter regulations, and a shift in what manufacturers were allowed to build. Yet despite all of that, demand remained strong because people were not ready to let go of that era just yet. And then there was the Ford Mustang, a name that had already become legendary by the time 1975 arrived, but something interesting had happened to the Mustang. It had changed. The Mustang II, introduced in the mid-70s, was smaller, more efficient, very different from the powerful machines that made the name famous just a few years earlier. And this is where things started to get really interesting. Because while the Mustang II actually sold very well, it also marked a turning point. It showed that the era of raw power was fading, and something new was taking its place, something more practical, more controlled, more in line with the new reality of fuel shortages and economic pressure. At the same time, cars like the Dodge Charger and the Dodge Challenger, once icons of pure muscle, began to lose their identity. They were no longer the same machines that dominated the streets just a few years earlier. And for many enthusiasts, something felt off. Something felt like it was being lost, even if they couldn't fully explain it at the time. And that feeling would only grow stronger as the years went on. Another car that defined that era was the Chevrolet Monte Carlo, a different kind of appeal, less about raw aggression and more about style and comfort, long body lines, a smooth ride, a sense of luxury combined with performance. It represented another side of American car culture, one that valued presence and elegance as much as speed, and cars like this were incredibly popular, especially among drivers who wanted something that felt substantial, something that made an impression without needing to be the fastest thing on the road. And then you had cars like the Cadillac Eldorado, representing the absolute peak of American automotive luxury, massive, bold, unapologetically large, with designs that made no attempt to be subtle. These were cars built to be seen, cars that symbolized success. And for many people, owning one was not just about transportation, it was about achievement, about reaching a certain point in life. But just like everything else, even this segment would eventually face the same pressures that were reshaping the industry. Now, imagine the environment of the time: gas stations becoming more crowded, fuel prices rising, people starting to think differently about how much their cars consumed. And at the same time, smaller foreign cars beginning to enter the market, cars that offered something different, something practical, something efficient, and slowly, almost quietly, consumer preferences began to shift, not all at once. Not in a way that was immediately obvious, but enough to start changing the direction of the entire industry. And here is where the real transformation begins, because the cars that people once dreamed about did not disappear overnight. They faded, they changed, they adapted, sometimes in ways that stripped away what made them special. Engines became smaller, designs became more conservative, and the bold personality that defined the late 60s and early 70s started to give way to something more restrained, more standardized, more focused on efficiency than emotion. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, many of the cars that once dominated the roads were no longer recognizable in the same way. Some names survived, but the spirit behind them was different, and others simply vanished, discontinued, replaced, or forgotten. And if you look around today, you might notice something: those original versions, the ones people truly love, are rarely seen. They exist in collections, in garages, in memories, but not in everyday life the way they once did. And that raises an interesting question. Did those cars disappear because they were no longer good, or because the world around them changed so much that there was no longer a place for them? Because when you compare them to modern cars, it's clear that today's vehicles are more advanced, safer, more efficient, but at the same time, something feels different, something feels less personal, less unique, as if many modern cars are designed to meet the same expectations rather than stand out from them. Back then, cars took risks. They had bold designs, strong identities. They were not afraid to be different. And maybe that's why they are still remembered today, not just as machines, but as symbols of a time when driving felt different, when the road felt open in a way that is hard to describe now, when owning a car meant something more than just convenience. And maybe that's the real reason people still talk about the cars of 1975. Not because they were perfect, not because they were the fastest or the most efficient, but because they represented something that goes beyond specifications, something emotional, something tied to a moment in history that can't be recreated. So the cars that everyone wanted in 1975 didn't just vanish. They became part of something bigger, something that still lives on in the way people remember them, in the way collectors preserve them, in the way enthusiasts talk about them decades later. And maybe the real question isn't just what happened to those cars, but what happened to the feeling they gave people. And if somehow one of those cars appeared today exactly as it was back then, unchanged, unmodified, brought back from that era, would people still want it for what it is? Or have we changed too much to appreciate it the same way? Because in the end, maybe those cars didn't disappear at all. Maybe they're still here, just not in the places we usually look anymore.